heard the phrase, whether it's said to someone with whom you're co-parenting or someone you're working with at the office. There comes a time when you try to decide what you're going to deal with or what you're not going to deal with. And the phrase that might be uttered is, I'm not going to die on that hill. There are a lot of times when we have to choose what is important to us and what isn't. It's been my experience over the years, most of us don't have a trouble coming up with what's number one in our life. The problem is deciding what's second or third or fourth. We're about to hear some words from the gospel that we call Matthew, in which Jesus kind of goes, as we say in my profession, from preaching to meddling. He's talking to his disciples and through them to us about what's important and where sometimes we have to make a stand. So if you would join me in the 10th chapter of Matthew, beginning at verse 34 and going through to the end of the chapter, which is verse 42. Together, let's listen for a word from God. Jesus says, "Do not think I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of the disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The word of the Lord. I had to look it up. One of my favorite musicals is Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. And during a very important scene, he says to his nemesis, Aaron Burr, "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what'll you fall for?" At the time, I thought, that seems a little anachronistic. But upon doing some historical research, I found that although he might not have said it in quite those words, that was what Alexander Hamilton said and what he believed. When you don't stand for anything, you can fall. When you don't stand for something, you can fall for anything. In my lifetime, another American poet, a guy named Robert Zimmerman, was fond of saying, you gotta serve someone. It's up to you to choose which master. You may not know him as Robert Zimmerman. We grew up knowing him as Bob Dylan. But all throughout history, there comes a point in time in which we have to make hard choices. And the words that Jesus says in this passage are hard words. This doesn't sound like the Prince of Peace to me, does it to you? A Prince of Peace bringing about a sword? Well, over the years, we've kind of decided it may not have been a literal sword, but factions and tensions in our life that can cut our hearts straight open. We'd like to think that we know where our loyalties stand. But it's hard, isn't it, to go against something Mama taught you? To go against something that the rest of the community believes is right. or even Mrs. Riddle, our second grade Sunday school teacher who taught us with such love. To go against them seems to be being disrespectful, doesn't it? But at some time, as Jesus says here, we have to decide who's going to be second or third on our list of priorities and go with the only thing that needs to be number one, and that is following the heart of God. Now, disciples of Christ, we handle things a little differently. We understand the gospel a little differently than perhaps other flavors of Christianity do. It is our understanding that to be a follower of Christ is something that we choose. We are believers in believers' baptism. That as a certain point, as a thinking, critically thinking, cognitive person, we say, this is a decision I'm making, not a decision that someone else has made for me as a baby. The problem is, as Jesus says here and says over and over again, that is not a priority we can take on and take off again as if it were a jacket or a hat. Once that priority is made as number one, other things have to go by the wayside, have to take an appropriate place. Jesus mentions bearing a cross. There are a lot of us who were complaining even a month ago that one of the biggest sacrifices in our lives were we weren't able to get haircuts, or we were feeling closed in. I guess for some people that is a form of bearing the cross, but you and I both know it's more serious than that. By choosing to follow in the footsteps of this one, we have agreed to bear a cross. The cross of our own mistakes, the consequences of our own actions, as well as the troubles and the ills of this world. By following this one, we do not get to say, I will follow, but only if it doesn't interfere with the rest of my life. We don't get to say, I will follow as long as it doesn't take me out of my comfort zone. And herein lies the rub. Jesus says point blank, whoever would save their own life will lose it. Which is just another way of saying, if my life is so important to me, then I've got to hold on to it and craft it so carefully that there's no hurt, there's no discomfort, there's nothing that somehow seeps in and interferes. Is that really a life worth living? And if it is it really the life that we are called to lead? We all have a mission. We all have a calling. Whether it is greeting a prophet, and of course back then prophets didn't mean fortune tellers. Prophets were those who came forward to give God's message. A friend of mine in ministry used to say, another way of thinking of a prophet is one who stands up and says, if you keep on doing what you've always done, you'll keep on getting what you've always gotten. If we cannot welcome those people into our lives and say, let me listen. If we cannot welcome a righteous person into our lives and say, maybe there is something to be learned. And if we cannot offer even a cup of cold water to the ones that Jesus refers to as the little ones, the message we're given there is pretty strong. That there's truth and there is dignity in each and every human being. And we are to respond, whether it's in a great way or a small way, to every single one. The number of times in my life I have sat across my desk from someone who says, I know I ought to join the church, or I know I need to quit drinking, or I know I need to do this or that. And then it follows, it would break my grandmother's heart. And when I say, do you visit your grandmother often? And so often the response is, I go by her grave every, yeah. You kind of wonder who's first. Now, I'm a grandmother myself. I was raised by a grandmother. I got no beef against grandmas. But at some point, who we chose to follow needs to be the one we follow. In a few minutes, we go to the communion table, and we're going to talk for a minute about Peter and Jesus. But right now, I want to tell you a story a little closer to home. It was a story that was told to me the day I was ordained, and it haunts me and follows me and keeps me honest. In the late 50s, there was a wonderful Southern Baptist minister by the name of Duke McCall. He went on to be the president of the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, back when it was really kind of a moving and shaking kind of place. Dr. McCall was about this tall, but was a powerhouse in the pulpit. And he was preaching in the deep South in the 50s. But he knew who his number one priority was. He knew what the gospel was calling him to say and to do. And so one Sunday night, he called the deacons of the church together. The deacons in a Southern Baptist church are kind of like the elders and deacons we have here. They're kind of the ones that kind of rule the roost. And he announced that henceforth in this huge Southern Baptist church, that Black people and other people of color were going to be welcomed into the worship service, which was news. And secondly, he said, and from now on, whoever wishes to take communion can. This to a body of Southern Baptist believers who maintained that only people who belonged to their church could practice communion. Well, so the story goes. When Dr. McCall left the meeting, he left to a room full of silence. And the next week, the Sunday after church, when Dr. McCall was seated at his desk after the service, in came the chair of the deacons, who also happened to be a very tall man. And the way Dr. McCall tells the story, this tall deacon leaned over Dr. McCall's desk and he said, Dr. McCall, you need to know this. The deacons of this church do not approve of what you are saying and doing. And Dr. McCall said he stood up to his full height, which wasn't much, and he had to physically look all the way up to this man's face. And he said this: there is only one set of eyes in which I need to see approval. And they're not in your face. It's so hard, isn't it, to want to see approval in our families and our friends. But sometimes that sword comes in because when we stand for one thing, we might have to stand against people we love. But for a life worth living, there is only one set of eyes in which we need to see approval. And please God, we know whose eyes